The book of Ruth is one of my favorites in the Old Testament, probably because back when I was in seminary, it's the book that we used when I was learning Hebrew. But it's also a story of sadness, faithfulness, intrigue, love, hope, and a rather large scandal. This short book follows two widows trying to find a place to survive who find far more than they could imagine. And today's part of the story is its beginning, when a man named Elimelech, his wife Naomi, and his sons Mahlon and Chilion flee from Bethlehem of Judah to Moab because of a famine. Doesn't Bethlehem, that one comes up again, doesn't it? Bethlehem and Judah. I feel like that's important. So they flee to the land of Moab because there's a famine, and it's also kind of funny because this whole Bethlehem famine thing is an amazing pun that you miss if you don't know Hebrew. Because Bethlehem means the house of bread. And so there's a famine in the house of bread. There's no bread in the house of bread. Just a silly little pun. There's a lot of those in the Bible, but we don't get them because we don't speak Hebrew. But there's some great puns. Most people's names in the Bible are great puns. So anywho, they find themselves in Moab, and while they're in Moab, Elimelech dies. And so Naomi is left a widow with these two sons to care for. They grow up, they marry, Mahlon marrying Ruth and Chilion marrying Orpah, and not long after that, both of the sons die, leaving only these three widows. Naomi hears that in Israel the famine has passed, so she decides to go back home, and her two daughters-in-law go with her. Along the road, Naomi says to both of them, "Go back home, find other husbands, live your lives." And after much prodding, Orpah goes back. But Ruth refuses. Instead, she swears an oath to follow Naomi wherever she goes, forsaking her not just her people, but even her God, to follow Naomi until death. And that's where our reading stops. At this point in the story, that death could be very close to them. Life for a pair of widows in the Old Testament was not particularly easy, even with the provisions requiring farmers to leave a little bit of grain behind for the widows to collect. Even two women traveling alone is incredibly dangerous. Nothing about the path they're on is safe. And even if they should reach their destination, who knows what they'll find? Naomi hasn't been home in at least 10 years. And Ruth is going to somewhere that she has never been before. And Israel, despite God's commands to treat immigrants well, doesn't have the best track record when it comes to dealing with foreigners living among them. But Ruth had hope. Naomi didn't so much at this point. When they return to Bethlehem, you find out that Naomi is so bitter that she asks people to call her bitter. Can you imagine going home after 10 years and saying, "Don't call me Naomi anymore, just call me cranky"? But that's what she was. And you can kind of understand why she would feel that way. She has lost everything. And she is going home with nothing. And people being excited to see her just reminds her of everything that she has lost. But Ruth, though, Ruth is something different. Because even while Naomi seems to have no hope, that's all that Ruth seems to have. She doesn't know what she's going to experience back in Bethlehem. She doesn't know what's going to happen when they get there, what's going to happen, how they're going to find food, how they're going to find a place to live. The only thing Ruth has at this point is hope. And in this hope, she is a great example to us. Orpah, her sister-in-law, chose the safe route at Naomi's prodding. In some sense, Ruth is disobedient and Orpah is obedient because Orpah went back to Moab. We don't know what happened to Orpah after that. She could have had a great life in Moab, but we never hear about her again. Except if you're ever wondering some random trivia about Oprah Winfrey, because her actual name is Orpah, but it got mispronounced so much when she was a kid that she just started going by Oprah. So there you go. If you ever are in a trivia thing and Oprah Winfrey comes up, now you know some trivia. We got puns, we got trivia. Who knows what the rest of this sermon's going to be? But then we have Ruth. Ruth takes a risk to go somewhere she's never been, and she ends up with a book of the Bible named after her. With Ruth, her story was far more likely to end in obscurity. Her story would be far more likely to end with, and they got to Bethlehem and they starved. But Ruth's risk paid off. For Ruth, a series of completely unbelievable coincidences led to her marrying well and ultimately becoming the grandmother of Israel's most popular king, King David. And of course, these several generations down the road, Jesus himself. But that's the weird thing about the kind of risk that Ruth was taking. Because when a risk gets taken with God, it usually ends up leading to a series of unbelievable coincidences leading to something good happening. When we look at risks in our lives, it's kind of the old make a pro list and make a con list and see which one balances out, right? We go, okay, so if I take this risk and I do this, these things would be good, but these things would be bad, and well, the con list is bigger, so I'm not doing that thing. If Ruth was to make a pro and con list about going with Naomi back to Bethlehem, the pro list would be, I'll be with Naomi, and the con list would be really, really long. It would be a smarter decision for Ruth to have stayed in Moab. But Ruth took a risk. But it wasn't just an ordinary risk. It was a risk in faith. Because she knew about God. She knew that Naomi's God was different from the gods of Moab. So that she can say to Naomi, I will follow you, I will follow your God, and go with you back to Bethlehem, even if it means my death. And so the rest of Ruth's story is watching what happens after she takes this risk. How she just so happens to show up in the field of someone who protects her. How she just so happens to show up in the field of someone who is a close relation and can redeem not just Elimelech's property, but Ruth herself. Just so happens that the next closest person doesn't want anything to do with the property. It just so happens, and you get the picture. The book of Ruth is a series of it just so happened. And even though you don't see explicitly God moving in the book of Ruth, you see him moving more in the way that we do in our own lives. When we start going a direction with God and then things just so happen. And so the book of Ruth is a reminder to us that even when we look forward and we don't see anything there, in God we can find hope. When we find ourselves in a situation that feels hopeless, we can look to God and find our hope. Because that's what the Christian life is all about. It's about taking a risk with God Not just taking a risk on our own, but taking it with God. And that's what makes all the difference. Because when we take those risks that God is calling us to, things just seem to work out. Ruth put her faith in God, which led to her making this oath to Naomi. And then we see all of the ways that God made a way for her. Her risk in faith was where God was leading her, and God used her in incredible ways. So the question to us then is, where is God leading us? To what unknown is God calling us to accomplish his purpose, even if it means taking a risk that might make us uncomfortable? God's call for us is, and always has been, follow me. That by itself is a big enough risk, but the risk is worth it. Because the things of God are better than the things of this world. So what will our story be? Do we choose, like Orpah, to take the safe route, the smart route? Or do we step out in faith like Ruth and follow God even if we don't know where it will lead?